The night god spoke, my journey from lust, captive to chosen. Vessel Chapter 1, The Pastor's Mask. The morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of Christ Redeemer Church in Nairobi's Eastlands district, casting colorful patterns across Jabari's face as he delivered his sermon. His voice resonated with conviction as he spoke about integrity and living a life worthy of God's calling. When we walk in the light of truth, there is nothing to hide, nothing to fear, Jabari proclaimed, his tall frame commanding attention, his deep voice carrying to the back of the packed church. The congregation responded with enthusiastic amens and hallelujahs. As the service ended, congregants lined up to shake his hand, many sharing how his words had touched them. Among them was Mama Wangari, an elderly woman who held his hands firmly in hers. Pastor Jabari, your message today was exactly what my grandson needed to hear. He's been so lost lately. Would you speak with him? Of course. Bring him to my youth. Counseling session on Thursday, Jabari replied with a warm smile. After the last church member left, Jabari retreated to his modest office. He locked the door, pulled the blinds shut, and slumped into his chair. The smile that had graced his face moments ago dissolved into an expression of anguish. He pulled out his phone, hesitated, then opened an incognito browser tab. His thumb hovered over the keyboard before he slammed the phone down on the desk. Not again. Not today, he whispered, pressing his palms against his eyes. Later that evening, in his small apartment in Umoja Estate, Jabari sat alone at his kitchen table, Bible open but unread. The sounds of Nairobi's nightlife drifted through his window. Music from nearby bars, the occasional matatu horn, neighbors' conversations. But Jabari was lost in his own turmoil. His phone buzzed with a text message from David, a fellow pastor. Great sermon today, brother. You're changing lives. Jabari stared at the message, feeling the weight of his hypocrisy crushing him. If they only knew, he thought. If they knew that their respected pastor Jabari, graduate of Nairobi Evangelical Graduate School of Theology, mentor to troubled youth, spent his nights battling and often surrendering to the very sins he preached against. He opened his journal and wrote, Day 3 of trying again. God, why can't I break free? These chains of lust feel heavier each time I fail. How can I guide others when I'm so lost myself? The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his mother calling from their rural home in Kikuyu. Mwanangu, she said, using the Swahili term of endearment. Your grandmother is not well. The doctors in Muranga can't help. She's asking for you. Jabari felt a pang of genuine concern cut through his self-loathing. His grandmother, Naina, had raised him after his father died, teaching him the old stories and prayers before he had embraced Christianity. I'll come tomorrow, he promised. Tell her to hold on. As he packed a small bag for the journey, Jabari felt a strange mix of dread and relief. Perhaps the rural setting, away from internet access and the temptations of the city, would give him some respite from his cycle of sin and shame. What he didn't realize was that this trip would become the turning point in his spiritual journey, the beginning of an unexpected path to redemption. Chapter 2, Return to Roots. The matatu lurched around another bend as it climbed the winding road toward Muranga County. Jabari pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching as Nairobi's concrete jungle gave way to the lush, green landscapes of central Kenya. The red soil paths, the terraced hillsides with coffee and tea plantations, the scattered mud and thatch houses, all familiar sights from his childhood. The driver had the radio tuned to a local station playing gospel music in Kikuyu. Jabari found himself softly singing along to a hymn his grandmother had taught him long ago. It spoke of God's faithfulness through generations, a message that now felt both comforting and accusing. When the matatu finally dropped him at the market, Center nearest his village, Jabari shouldered his backpack and began the 3-kilometer walk along a narrow dirt path. Children playing by the roadside recognized him immediately. "Pastor Jabari Amakom," they shouted, running alongside him for a while before darting back to their games. The village hadn't changed much. Women balanced large water containers on their heads as they returned from the communal well. Elders sat under the shade of an ancient fig tree, engaged in animated conversation that paused briefly as they waved to him. The scent of cooking fires and the distant lowing of cattle created a symphony of rural life that stirred deep memories. As he approached his grandmother's compound, Jabari's cousin Kamau spotted him and came running. "Cousin, thank God you've come," he said, embracing Jabari. "Nina has been asking for you since morning. The fever comes and goes, but her spirit remains strong." Jabari nodded, feeling a knot of worry tighten in his stomach. "How long has she been sick?" "Almost 2 weeks," Kamau replied, leading him toward the main house. "The local dispensary gave her some medicine, but at 92. He left the implication hanging in the air. The family compound consisted of several small structures. The main house built of bricks with a corrugated metal roof and 2 traditional mud huts with thatched roofs that Naina had insisted on preserving. She lived in one of these huts, refusing the comfort of the modern house even as her age advanced. Jabari ducked through the low doorway of his grandmother's hut. The interior was dim, lit only by sunlight filtering through a small window. Familiar smell of herbs and wood smoke filled the space. Naina lay on a simple bed, covered with colorful hand-woven blankets despite the afternoon heat. "Grandmother," Jabari called softly, kneeling beside her bed. Nina's eyes opened slowly, clouded with age but still sharp with intelligence. A smile transformed her deeply wrinkled face when she recognized him. "Mwana wa mwana wakwa," she whispered. "Child of my child." Her thin hand reached out to touch his face. "You have come." "Of course I came," Jabari said, taking her hand. It felt so fragile, like holding a bird. "I'll pray for you, and we'll get you to a better hospital in Nairobi if needed." Naina shook her head slightly. "No hospitals. I have lived my years. But before I go to the ancestors, there are things that must be said between us." Her eyes, suddenly clear and penetrating, locked onto his. "Things about the burden you carry?" Jabari felt a chill run through him. "What do you mean, Naina?" "The spirits show me things in dreams," she said, switching to Kikuyu, although a devout Christian now. Nina still sometimes spoke in the traditional spiritual language of her youth. "I see you chained in darkness, my child, fighting alone." Jabari swallowed hard. "It's just stress from my work at the church," he deflected. "Don't worry about me." Naina's grip on his hand tightened with surprising strength. "No more lies," she whispered. "Not here, not now. The God you preach about sees everything, just as our ancestors did. You cannot hide from either." Something in her words broke through Jabari's carefully constructed defenses. Tears welled in his eyes as the weight of years of deception suddenly became unbearable. "I'm not who they think I am, Naina," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I preach about freedom while I'm a prisoner myself." "I know," she said simply. "That is why you were sent back to me. To remember who you were before the chains, to find your true path." As evening fell, Jabari sat by his grandmother's bedside, watching her sleep. The hut had no electricity, and he had no internet connection on his phone. Cut off from his digital temptations and surrounded by the simplicity of village life, he felt naked before God, stripped of distractions and masks. Here, in the silence broken only by night insects and his grandmother's soft breathing, Jabari would face his darkest night and, unknown to him, his brightest dawn. Chapter 3. The Dark Night. 3 days into his stay at the village, Jabari fell into the rhythm of rural life. He woke with the roosters, helped Kamau milk the family cows, and spent hours by his grandmother's side. Naina's condition fluctuated. Some hours she was lucid and strong, telling stories from the colonial era and independence struggles. Other times she drifted into feverish sleep, murmuring prayers in a mixture of Kikuyu and the English she had learned from missionaries. Without internet access and surrounded by family members in the small compound, Jabari had no opportunity to indulge his secret addiction. At first, he felt the familiar restlessness, the craving that usually led him to seek isolation with his phone. But as days passed, a different kind of discomfort emerged. Not the physical withdrawal he expected, but a profound spiritual unease. On the fourth night, after a simple dinner of ugali and sukuma wiki shared with his relatives, Jabari retreated to the second mud hut where he was staying. It had been his childhood home, preserved much as it was when he lived there with Nina after his father's death. The kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls, decorated with yellowing family photographs and his old-school certificates. Unable to sleep, Jabari decided to fast and pray for his grandmother's healing and for his own deliverance. He knelt on the earthen floor, opened his Bible to the Psalms, and began to read aloud. "Out of the depths I cry to you, Lord. Lord, hear my voice." Hours passed as Jabari alternated between reading scripture, praying, and sitting in silence. Around midnight, the physical and emotional exhaustion of the past days caught up with him. His body demanded rest, but his mind continued its relentless battle. As he lay on his narrow bed, sleep remained elusive. In the darkest hour before dawn, Jabari entered a state between wakefulness and dreaming. The hut seemed to grow darker still, the shadows elongating and taking shape. He felt a weight on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. A familiar shame and guilt washed over him, the same feeling that followed each of his failures with pornography. "You are a fraud," a voice seemed to whisper in the darkness. "A hypocrite who preaches purity while defiling his own mind. How many young men have you counseled, claiming to offer God's wisdom, while you yourself are enslaved?" Jabari tried to pray, but the words died in his throat. The accusations continued, growing louder, more specific, highlighting each failure, each moment of weakness throughout his ministry. He felt as though every sin was being laid bare, dissected under the harsh light of judgment. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the darkness. "God, I have tried to stop so many times." The suffocating pressure intensified. In his half-dreaming state, Jabari saw himself in a dark prison cell, heavy chains binding his wrists and ankles. The walls of the cell were covered with screens displaying the very images he had consumed in secret, a visual representation of his bondage. Jabari fell to his knees within this vision, no longer fighting against the chains, but acknowledging their reality and his powerlessness to break them himself. "I cannot free myself," he admitted, tears streaming down his face. "I've tried and failed too many times. If I am to be delivered, it must be by your hand alone." At the moment of this surrender, something shifted in the atmosphere of both the vision and the physical hut. A light appeared, not blinding or dramatic, but gentle, like the first rays of dawn breaking through the darkness. It grew gradually brighter, illuminating the prison cell. Jabari watched as the chains that bound him began to dissolve where the light touched them. He heard his name spoken, not in accusation, but with profound love, in his mother tongue, Jabari. This voice was unlike any he had heard, both powerful and intimate, ancient, yet immediately present. "I did not choose you because you were perfect," the voice continued in Kikuyu. "I chose you to demonstrate my power through your weakness. Your Chains are not broken because of your strength, but because of my love. As the last chain dissolved in his vision, Jabari felt a physical sensation of warmth spreading through his body, starting from his chest and flowing outward to his limbs. The oppressive weight lifted. He gasped, drawing in deep breaths of the cool night air. The vision faded, and Jabari found himself back in the physical reality of the mud hut, dawn light now seeping through the small window. He was on his knees beside the bed, arms outstretched, tear tracks dried on his face. But something was fundamentally different. The shame that had been his constant companion for years had been replaced by a profound peace. As the morning birds began their chorus outside, Jabari remained kneeling, not in desperation now, but in awe. For the first time in years, he felt clean. Not by his own efforts, but by grace that had come to him in his darkest hour. What he didn't yet know was that while he experienced this spiritual breakthrough, something equally miraculous was happening in his grandmother's hut just a few yards away. Chapter 4. The Elder's Vision. The village stirred to life as the sun climbed over the hills of Muranga. Jabari emerged from his hut, blinking in the bright morning light. He felt simultaneously exhausted and invigorated, as if he had fought a great battle and emerged victorious. The events of the night still resonated within him: the darkness, the chains, the voice, the liberation. He wasn't entirely sure if it had been a dream, a vision, or a supernatural encounter, but he knew with certainty that something profound had changed within him. For the first time in years, he didn't wake up with the familiar weight of shame and the compulsive urge to check his phone. Instead, he felt a clarity of mind and lightness of spirit that seemed almost foreign after so long. As he walked to the outdoor washing area to splash water on his face, Kamau came running toward him, eyes wide with excitement. "Jabari, come quickly! It's a miracle!" Alarmed, Jabari followed his cousin at a run, fearing the worst about his grandmother. They reached Naina's hut, where a small crowd of relatives had already gathered, their voices a mixture of amazement and joy. Pushing through the doorway, Jabari stopped short at the sight before him. Naina was sitting up in bed, alert and animated, talking and laughing with his mother and aunts. The frailty that had marked her for days seemed to have diminished overnight. Her eyes were clear, her voice strong. When she saw Jabari, she extended her arms toward him. "Mwana wa mwana wakwa," she called. "Come and see what God has done." Jabari approached cautiously, kneeling beside her bed. "Naina, you're better?" "The fever broke in the night," his mother explained, wiping happy tears from her eyes. "We thought—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Jabari understood. They had feared Naina was reaching her final days. The old woman took Jabari's hands in hers, studying his face intently. "Something has changed in you as well," she said, switching to Kikuyu so the others wouldn't understand their private conversation. "I see it in your eyes. The chains are broken." Jabari stared at her in shock. "How do you know about the chains?" Naina smiled mysteriously. "Last night, as the fever left me, I was given a vision. I saw you in a dark place, bound by heavy chains. Then a light came, and a voice spoke. The same voice that has guided our people since before the white man brought his Bible, though now we know his true name." "You saw my vision?" Jabari whispered, goosebumps rising on his arms. "Not your vision, Moana. The same vision, given to both of us at once. This is the old way. When God needs to confirm a message, he gives it to two witnesses." She squeezed his hands firmly. "I have known of your struggle for many years." Jabari felt a flash of shame. "You knew about my addiction?" Nina nodded solemnly. "The spirit world has few secrets, whether you call it by our ancestors' names or by your Christian understanding. 3 years ago, I dreamed of you trapped in a web made of light and darkness. The web came from a small box you carried everywhere. She tapped his pocket where his phone usually sat. I didn't understand then what it meant, but I knew you were in bondage. Jabari lowered his head, overwhelmed by the realization that his private struggle had been spiritually visible to his grandmother all along. But the second part of that vision, Naina continued, her voice growing stronger, showed you breaking free and leading many others out of the same trap. God told me then that your greatest shame would become your greatest purpose. She reached under her pillow and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. This belonged to your grandfather. Inside is soil from Mount Kenya, which our people believe is where God dwells. He collected it during the Mau Mau resistance when he prayed for liberation from the colonizers. She pressed it into Jabari's palm. Now it passes to you, for you will lead another kind of liberation movement. The other family members watched in respectful silence, even though they couldn't understand the Kikuyu conversation. They recognized a spiritual mantle being passed from one generation to the next. But how can I help others when I've only just been freed myself? Jabari asked, clutching the leather pouch. Nina's eyes sparkled with wisdom. That is precisely why you can help them. The healed wound becomes a source of healing for others. Your story, the full truth of it, will be the key that unlocks many prisons. As the family celebrated Nina's recovery with a feast of traditional foods and songs of praise that blended Christian hymns with Kikuyu melodies, Jabari sat slightly apart, contemplating the path ahead. For the first time in years, when he thought about returning to Nairobi, he felt neither dread nor the anticipation of falling back into old patterns. Instead, he felt a sense of purpose and mission that transcended his personal struggle. That night, he wrote in his journal, "The night God spoke. He didn't just free me from my chains, he showed me why I wore them for so long. Some must walk through the darkness to become guides for others lost in the same night." Chapter 5. Return to Nairobi. Week after his transformative experience, Jabari boarded a matatu back to Nairobi. Nina's health had continued to improve dramatically, and the family no longer feared for her immediate well-being. Before leaving, he had spent hours with his grandmother, receiving her wisdom and blessing for the path that lay ahead. As the vehicle wound its way down from the highlands toward the sprawling metropolis, Jabari felt a familiar anxiety rising, but for a different reason than before. Previously, returns to Nairobi meant resuming his double life, the constant tension between his public ministry and private sins. Now he worried about how to integrate his newfound freedom and calling into his existing life. What will my congregation think if I tell them the truth? He wondered, watching the landscape transition from rural greenery to the urban sprawl of satellite towns. Will the church board ask me to step down? Will the young men I mentor lose faith in everything I've taught them? His phone, which had remained mostly off during his time in the village, buzzed with notifications as it connected to Nairobi's network. Messages from church elders, youth group leaders, and congregation members flooded in, asking about his return and upcoming sermons. One text from David, his fellow pastor, caught his eye. "Brother, we need you back. The youth conference is in 2 weeks, and you're scheduled to lead the men's purity session, praying for your safe return." The irony wasn't lost on Jabari. The very topic that had been his greatest struggle was what people looked to him to address. In the past, these sessions had been exercises in hypocrisy, filled with generic advice he himself couldn't follow. The thought of standing before young men again, pretending to have answers he didn't possess, made him physically ill. But something had changed. He no longer felt the need to pretend. The words of his vision echoed in his mind. "I did not choose you because you were perfect. I chose you to demonstrate my power through your weakness." By the time the matatu reached the chaotic River Road terminal in downtown Nairobi, Jabari had made a decision. He would not return to ministry as if nothing had happened. He would not continue the pretense. Whatever the cost, He would share his full story, the struggle, the failure, and the miraculous intervention that had broken his chains. His apartment in Umoja Estate felt strange after the simplicity of village life. The modern furniture, television, and bookshelves full of theological works seemed to belong to another person, the carefully constructed persona of Pastor Jabari rather than the man who had knelt broken on an earthen floor and found liberation. That evening, he called David and asked him to come over. If he was going to reshape his ministry, he needed to start with honesty among his closest colleagues. When David arrived, Jabari made them both chai and then, sitting across from his friend at the small kitchen table, began to speak. "I have something important to tell you about why I was really away," he started, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "And about who I really am." For the next 2 hours, Jabari shared everything. His years-long battle with pornography, the cycle of shame and relapse, the mask he had worn while preaching, and finally, the supernatural encounter in his grandmother's village that had broken the cycle. David sat in stunned silence, his expressions shifting from shock to concern to compassion. When Jabari finished, the room grew quiet except for the distant sounds of the estate's nightlife filtering through the window. "So," Jabari concluded, "I can't stand before those young men at the conference and pretend to have easy answers, but I can share my real journey if the church will allow it." David was quiet for a moment longer before responding. "The elders will have questions. Some may call for your resignation." He paused, then reached across the table to grip Jabari's shoulder. "But I believe this is exactly what our young men need to hear. Not polished theories from someone who's never struggled, but truth from someone who's found victory through grace." The next Sunday, Jabari stood before the church board in a small room behind the sanctuary. 7 elders, all respected community leaders, listened as he shared his testimony. Some faces hardened with disappointment, others softened with understanding. When he finished, the head elder, Mizi Kariuki, asked the others to leave the room so he could speak with Jabari alone. "What you have done required great courage," the older man said once they were alone. "But I must ask you, are you prepared for the consequences of making this public? Not everyone will understand or accept it." "I understand the risk," Jabari replied, "but I've lived too long in fear of being discovered. I'd rather choose transparency and face the consequences than continue living behind a mask." Mizi Kariuki studied him for a long moment before nodding. Slowly, "There is something different about you now. Your grandmother would say it is the spirit of your ancestors walking with you. I say it is the Holy Spirit." He smiled slightly. "Perhaps they are not so different." He stood and extended his hand. "You have my support, but the path will not be easy." 2 days later, the board delivered their decision. Jabari would remain as pastor, but would take a month of limited duties for spiritual renewal. He could share his testimony at the upcoming youth conference as planned, but they would observe the response before making longer-term decisions. That night, Jabari sat at his computer, but not to seek the images that had once enslaved him. Instead, he began typing out his full testimony, every detail of his struggle, his failure, and his deliverance. As words flowed onto the screen, he felt a sense of purpose, stronger than anything he had experienced in years of ministry. "This," he whispered, to himself, "is what I was actually called to do." Chapter 6. Broken Vessels. The Nairobi Youth Conference was held at a large event center in Kasarani, on the outskirts of the city. More than 500 young men and women from churches across Kenya had gathered for 3 days of worship, teaching, and fellowship. The energy was palpable. Young voices raised in praise songs that blended traditional hymns with contemporary African beats, prayers offered in Swahili, English, and local languages. On the second day, Jabari was scheduled to Lead the men's breakout session on purity and godly relationships. As young men aged 16 to 30 filed into the conference room, Jabari stood at the podium, feeling a strange mixture of terror and peace. There was no PowerPoint presentation this time, no carefully crafted sermon with 3 alliterative points and a clever conclusion. He had only his story and the leather pouch from Mount Kenya that his grandmother had given him, which now sat in his pocket. When the room was full, nearly 200 young men waiting expectantly, Jabari stepped away from the podium and moved to the edge of the stage, sitting down so he was closer to his audience. "I had planned to give you a standard talk today," he began, his voice softer than usual, forcing the young men to lean in to hear him. "I was going to quote scriptures about fleeing from temptation, about keeping your heart pure, about honoring God with your body, all true things." He paused, looking across the sea of faces. "But instead, I'm going to tell you a story about a pastor who was dying inside while preaching life to others." A hush fell over the room as Jabari began to share, not in vague terms but with specific details, about his years-long secret struggle with pornography. He described the shame, the isolation, the failed attempts to break free, and the growing gap between his public persona and private reality. "I became an expert at managing my sin rather than eliminating it," he confessed. "I knew exactly how many days I needed to be clean before preaching to feel less hypocritical. I had accountability systems that I learned to work around. I counseled young men about issues I hadn't conquered myself." As he spoke, he noticed some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others nodding in somber recognition, and a few openly wiping away tears. The vulnerability in the room was almost tangible. Then Jabari shared about his grandmother's illness, his return to the village, and the supernatural encounter that had finally broken his chains. He pulled out the leather pouch and held it up. "My ancestors believed God dwelled on Mount Kenya. As Christians, we know God dwells within us through His Spirit. But sometimes we need to return to our roots, to the simplicity of direct encounter, to experience breakthrough." He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many young men as possible. "I stand before you today, not as someone who has never struggled, but as someone who has found freedom through surrender. Not through trying harder, not through more accountability, not through better internet filters, though those tools have their place, but through encountering the God who specializes in using broken vessels." As Jabari opened the floor for questions, hands shot up across the room. But rather than asking questions, young men began to stand and share their own struggles, some through tears, others with trembling voices. One by one, they broke their silence about addictions to pornography, sexual relationships they couldn't seem to end, shame they had carried for years. A young university student named Thomas stood and spoke with quiet intensity. "I've been to, 3 different counselors at church. None of them actually understood. They gave me Bible verses and told me to pray more. But you've been where I am. You know it's not that simple." "You're right," Jabari acknowledged. "It's not simple. And I don't have a formula, but I know now that healing begins with bringing darkness into light, just as you're all doing today." What had been scheduled as a 1-hour session stretched to 3 as young men continued to share, to pray for one another, to exchange phone numbers for real accountability. When they finally concluded, something extraordinary had occurred. A community of honesty had formed where masks and pretense had previously ruled. As the young men filed out, many stopped to embrace Jabari, to whisper thanks, or simply to look him in the eye with newfound hope. The last to approach was a pastor, from Western Kenya, somewhat older than the others. "I came to chaperone our youth," he said quietly. "But I'm trapped in the same prison you described. I've been there for 12 years. Jabari embraced the man. "Then let's walk toward freedom together," he said. News of what had happened in the men's session spread quickly through the conference. Before Jabari left that evening, the conference organizer approached him. "We've had requests from over 50 churches for you to come and share your testimony," she said, handing him a stack of contact information. "This is something our congregations have needed for a long time. A leader brave enough to be honest about the real battles our young people are facing." Driving home that night, Jabari reflected on how differently the day had unfolded from what he had feared. Instead of rejection or scandal, his vulnerability had created a space for authentic community and healing. His phone buzzed with messages from young men already sharing their small victories and ongoing struggles, reaching out for counsel not from a perfect pastor, but from a fellow traveler who had found a path through the wilderness. He pulled over along Thika Road, watching the headlights of passing cars create streams of light against the darkness. He took out his journal and wrote, "Today I witnessed the power of a broken vessel. When I poured out my brokenness, God poured in his healing, not just for me but for many. This is what redemption looks like. The very wound becomes the place through which others find healing." Chapter 7. The Mountain Retreat. 6 months after the youth conference, Jabari stood at the base of Mount Kenya, watching as 3 buses unloaded their passengers, 78 men ranging in age from 17 to 65, coming from all parts of Kenya and even neighboring Uganda and Tanzania. They had all responded to an invitation for what Jabari had called the Chosen Vessel Retreat. In the months since sharing his testimony, Jabari's ministry had transformed completely. While he still preached regularly at Christ Redeemer Church, much of his time was now dedicated to a new outreach specifically focused on men struggling with sexual temptation and addiction. What had begun as informal meetings in his living room had quickly grown, necessitating larger venues and additional leaders. Not everyone had supported his new direction. Some church members had left, uncomfortable with such open discussion of sensitive topics. 2 prominent families had withdrawn their financial support. But for every person who stepped away, it seemed 3 more appeared. Often men who had never before felt comfortable in church settings, who found in Jabari's ministry a rare combination of biblical truth and raw honesty. Now, as the men gathered their bags and formed a circle at the mountain's base, Jabari felt a profound sense of purpose. This 3-day retreat, combining hiking, prayer, African traditional cleansing rituals reinterpreted through a Christian lens, and intensive group sessions, represented the fulfillment of his grandmother's vision, his greatest shame transformed into his greatest ministry. "Welcome, brothers," Jabari called out, his voice carrying across the group. The men quieted, turning toward him expectantly. Many he knew from previous meetings, others he was meeting for the first time. "Before we begin our ascent, I want to be clear about why we're here," he continued. "We have not come to this mountain because it holds magical powers. We have come because sometimes we need to step away from our normal environment to hear God clearly. Our ancestors believed God dwelled on this mountain. As Christians, we know God dwells within us through His Spirit, but there is wisdom in seeking moments of retreat, as Jesus often did." He held up the leather pouch his grandmother had given him, now attached to a simple wooden staff. "This contains soil from this very mountain, collected by my grandfather decades ago. It reminds me that our journey toward freedom is both personal and collective. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, and we blaze trails for those who will come after." Over the next several hours, the group hiked to a plateau, where they established their base camp, a collection of large tents arranged in a circle around a central fire pit. As night fell and temperatures dropped, they gathered around the fire, wrapped in blankets, steam rising from cups of spiced tea. For this first session, Jabari invited 5 men to share their stories, each representing different backgrounds and struggles. A university professor spoke about his 20-year battle with pornography that had nearly cost him his marriage. A 19-year-old described growing up with unrestricted internet access and the damage it had caused to his view of women and relationships. A rural pastor admitted to affairs with church members and the web of lies he had created to cover his actions. As each man spoke, others nodded in recognition, sometimes reaching out to place a hand on a shoulder or arm in silent support. There were no interruptions, no quick solutions offered. Only the gift of being truly heard and accepted despite their darkest secrets. When the last speaker finished, Jabari stood and addressed the group. "Tomorrow we will climb higher, both literally up this mountain and figuratively into the roots of our struggles. But tonight, I want each of you to do something that may feel frightening." He paused, scanning the circle of firelit faces. "I want you to find a partner and share one thing about your struggle that you have never told anyone before. Something so shameful you've kept it buried. This isn't about shock value. It's about bringing the deepest darkness into light." A murmur ran through the group, a mixture of anxiety and recognition of the necessity of this step. As the men paired off and moved to find private spaces around the perimeter of the camp, Jabari remained by the fire, available for anyone who needed additional support. One by one, as they completed the exercise, men returned to the fire, many with tear-streaked faces but also with a visible lightness, as if setting down a heavy burden they had carried for too long. Some embraced their partners, forging bonds that transcended their brief acquaintance. By midnight, as many drifted off to sleep in their tents, a core group remained around the dying embers of the fire. Among them was Thomas, the university student from the youth conference who had been one of the first to respond to Jabari's testimony. "I was 6 months clean," Thomas said quietly. "Then last week, I failed again. I almost didn't come to the retreat because I felt so ashamed." "But you came anyway," Jabari noted. "That's the difference between before and now. The shame no longer has the final word." The next morning, the group hiked higher up the mountain, reaching a meadow plateau with a breathtaking view of the surrounding landscape. Here, Jabari led them through a series of exercises combining physical movement, prayer, and guided meditation. Each man placed a stone representing his specific struggle into a communal pile, symbolizing both the acknowledgement of their burdens and the shared nature of their journey. In the afternoon, they broke into smaller groups focused on specific aspects of recovery, practical accountability systems, rebuilding damaged relationships, addressing childhood wounds that contributed to addictive behaviors, spiritual disciplines for renewal of the mind. As sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the men gathered once more as a complete group. Jabari stood before them, the mountain breeze ruffling his clothes, the last light of day illuminating his face. "Brothers, there is something I need to confess to you," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected edge of vulnerability. "While I have experienced a profound liberation, the battle is not completely over. There are still moments of temptation, still days when the old patterns call to me." A ripple of surprise moved through the group. Many had placed Jabari on a pedestal, seeing him as someone who had achieved complete victory. "The difference," he continued, "is that these thoughts no longer control me. They no longer define me. And most importantly, I no longer face them alone." He gestured toward the circle of men. "This is the miracle. Not that we never struggle again, but that we struggle together in the light, rather than suffering alone in darkness." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial of olive oil, a Christian adaptation of the traditional Kikuyu ritual of anointing. "Tonight, as the sun sets on this mountain, I invite each of you to receive this anointing, not as a magical protection against temptation, but as a visible sign of an invisible reality. You are chosen vessels. Your brokenness does not disqualify you from God's purposes. It is precisely what qualifies you to carry His light to others still trapped in darkness." One by one, the men came forward. Jabari placed a small amount of oil on each forehead, speaking the same words to each. You are not chosen because you are perfect. You are chosen to demonstrate God's power through your weakness. You are a broken vessel through which His light shines brightest. As night fell completely, the group lit a large bonfire. Spontaneous worship broke out, some singing hymns, others offering prayers in various languages, a few dancing in traditional styles around the flames. The atmosphere shifted from somber reflection to joyous celebration, a tangible sense of liberation filling the mountain air. In the early hours of the morning, as most of the men finally retired to their tents, Jabari remained by the fire with a handful of others. Among them was Pastor Mwangi, the older minister from Western Kenya who had confessed his struggles after the youth conference. When I arrived yesterday, I was prepared to resign from ministry when I returned home, Mwangi said, staring into the flames. I felt too hypocritical to continue. And now? Jabari asked. Mwangi looked up, his face peaceful despite the visible fatigue. Now I understand that my congregation doesn't need a perfect pastor. They need a real one who can guide them through real struggles because he's walked the path himself. As dawn broke over Mount Kenya on the final day of the retreat, the men gathered for a closing ceremony. Each received a small leather pouch similar to the one Nina had given Jabari, containing a bit of soil from the mountain and a written commitment to continued accountability and honesty. Before descending, they formed a circle at the edge of the plateau, arms linked, facing outward toward the vast Kenyan landscape spread below them. Villages, towns, and distant parts of Nairobi were visible in the morning light, representing the communities to which each man would return, carrying not only his personal liberation, but also the responsibility to create spaces of honesty and healing for others. Jabari led them in a final prayer, his voice strong against the mountain wind. We came here as captives seeking freedom. We leave as chosen vessels, shaped by your hands, broken and mended, emptied of shame and filled with purpose. May the light that found us in our darkest nights now shine through us to guide others home. As they began their descent, Jabari found himself walking alongside Thomas, the young university student whose journey had in many ways paralleled his own. What happens when we go back? Thomas asked. When the retreat high fades and real life hits again? Jabari placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder. The same thing that happened to me when I left my grandmother's village. We remember that. Our freedom wasn't found in a place or an experience, but in a truth. Our weakness never diminished God's power to work through us. If anything, it magnified it. He paused, looking back up at the mountain peak, now bathed in full morning light. And we remember that we're not alone anymore. The greatest power of shame was in keeping us isolated. That power is broken now. As the group reached the buses waiting to take them back to their respective homes, a sense of both completion and beginning filled the air. Contacts were exchanged, regional support groups organized, follow-up meetings scheduled. What had begun as Jabari's personal deliverance had expanded into a movement of authenticity and healing that would continue to spread across churches, communities, and generations. On the drive back to Nairobi, Jabari called his grandmother. Despite her advanced age, Naina's voice came through strong and clear. Did they find what they were seeking on the mountain? She asked. They found something better, Jabari replied. They found each other. They found that they were never alone in their struggles. Naina's soft laughter carried through the phone. Then the vision is fulfilled. The chains that once bound you have become the keys that free others. As Jabari watched the Kenyan landscape roll past his window, he reflected on the extraordinary journey from that dark night in the mud hut to this moment. The shame that had once consumed him had been transformed into his greatest ministry. The addiction that had made him feel unworthy had become the very reason he could reach those who felt beyond redemption. In his journal that night, he wrote the words that would later become the title of his first book. The night God spoke, He didn't just break my chains. He forged them into a key that would unlock many prisons. This is the final miracle, that our deepest wounds become our greatest, offering our broken vessels the perfect containers for divine light.